Hi, everyone. This is Tracy from the social media ministry here at Calvary Lutheran Church in Oshkosh, and I have Pastor Jen with me. Hi, Pastor Jen.
Hi, Tracy.
So I have another question for you, Pastor Jen. So today's question is, what is the difference between the denominations that all claim the Lutheran label?
Okay, so if you go back a couple weeks ago, I talked about how denominations were completely independent and separate Christian organizations.
Right.
Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't, but they're managed, they're organized, their uh, executive functions are all completely separate.
Okay.
So all of the denominations that claim the name Lutheran all trace their roots back to a reformer in the 1500s by the name of Martin Luther.
Okay.
And Martin Luther had some arguments with the Catholic Church at the time over a lot of things. In fact, he posted 95 of them famously on the door of the Wittenberg Castle.
Yes.
So he had some arguments with the Catholic Church, and over the course of those arguments and the history that followed, the German people who agreed with Martin Luther became an independent church group, independent from the Roman Catholic Church.
Okay.
And there was lots of pain and anger and killings and all sorts of things over that, but they became an independent church group. Now, that independent church group that was all Lutherans, when they were in Germany, when they came to the U.S. and settled, they settled in different parts of the country.
Okay.
And probably in part because there wasn't the same ability to communicate and to transfer back and forth and to, be as connected.
Oh, sure. There were no cell phones
right.
or anything like that back then.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So probably, at least in part because of that, each of those groups developed kind of independent ideas
Okay.
about different things. And within those independent ideas, then, when they started talking and getting, or when they'd always been talking, but when they talked about, hey, why don't we form into a bigger single group of Lutherans in this country? Okay. Some of those groups of Lutherans said, yeah, let's do that. And
makes sense.
They became the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.
Okay.
And some of those groups of Lutherans said, we don't agree on enough. And so we're going to be separate and independent still.
Okay.
So the biggest disagreement between, so the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is the largest group of Lutherans in the country.
Okay. Oh, that's good to know. Little trivia for the day.
There you go. But there are several other Lutheran groups.
Yes.
Some of them are those historical groups like Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod. There's a few others that are very small that are in that category. And the biggest difference between those groups and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America surrounds really two things. Three. One is the ordination of women.
Okay, yep, that's a biggie.
That's a biggie. So within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we ordain women. Mm-hmm. Those other historical Lutheran groups, for the most part, do not allow women to serve in an ordained role. The argument being that Jesus Christ is a man, therefore whoever blesses the Lord's Supper has to be a man.
Yeah.
I find that to be a strange argument because I shouldn't be using any part of my reproductive organs to bless the Lord's Supper.
But that would be a completely different church. I don't think anybody wants to go to a kind like that. So, yeah.
But that's kind of the argument there.
Okay.
The other, another one of the big differences is how we celebrate Holy Communion.
Okay. So yeah, if anyone is welcome or
who's welcome and who's not. Within the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, most churches welcome everybody to the communion table because we don't feel it is our right to stand in the way of God's presence being available to people who come asking for God's presence.
Exactly. Not our place to judge.
So for the most part, we open the table to anybody. Okay. Here at Calvary, we do open the table to absolutely everybody. Some churches make some distinctions within the ELCA. They make some distinctions on age, what age people can start taking communion and how they've been educated.
Okay.
But that's mostly within the ELCA. Within the other historical Lutheran groups,
Mhm.
Those groups understand that, and in my opinion, this is not correct, of course, otherwise I'd be part of those groups, but those groups understand that if someone eats or drinks unworthily of the Lord's Supper, that they could be condemning themselves to hell through that action. And
Hmm.
so they stand as gatekeepers to make sure that the only people who take communion are people that they know, that they have educated, they have taught, they're members of their church, and therefore they know that they're not drinking themselves or eating or drinking themselves through communion into damnation. And so they only allow in specific members of their specific denomination
Right.
to come forward to the Lord's table.
Okay. Not very inviting.
Not very inviting. It's just a different theological take. Obviously, again, not one I agree with, but I want to be honest to who they are and that
Oh,
is
sure.
an important theological take that they make.
Yes.
And then the third difference, really, between the historical Lutheran denominations and ELCA is an understanding of what we call the inerrancy of Scripture.
Oh, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a big word. So inerrancy means there are no errors anywhere in Scripture. Everything was kind of dictated by God. It means exactly what it says in its basic meaning, which is why when it says women shall be silent in church and learn at all home in all submission from their husbands, they take that seriously and they don't ordain women.
Well, I would have a strong opinion about that. And
within the ELCA, we say that the scriptures are the inspired work of God.
Bit of a difference.
Which is a bit of a difference. We say that the writers who wrote the scriptures were inspired by God.
Okay.
But not that they were dictated to by God.
Okay, that's a big difference.
It is a big difference in how we understand Scripture. And it makes a difference in how we interpret Scripture.
Yes.
Therefore, we say some things, like women learning at home in all submission from their husbands, are bound by the time in which they were written and the experiences of the people who were writing, and are not, therefore, requirements of the church for all time, but rather a reflection of the time in which it was written.
That's a really good point on perspective. I like that.
So those are kind of the big differences between the ELCA and the historical Lutheran denominations.
Okay.
Now there's another group of Lutheran denominations, and they are there's really two of them, two groups that broke off from the ELCA.
Oh, okay.
So the ELCA was formed, and I'm not sure of the date, I didn't write it down, but in the second half of the last century.
Okay.
I want to say 80s.
Okay.
I think 87, but don't quote me on that because
Not
I didn't
that
write
long
it
ago.
down. So it's not been that long ago that this group of Lutherans all got together and agreed that, hey, we're together.
Okay.
Since that time, the ELCA has made some decisions, and some people within the ELCA and some congregations within the ELCA have not agreed with those decisions.
Okay.
There's been two big ones. The first one was in regards to who could preside at an ordination.
Okay.
When the ELCA was first formed, the only people who could preside at an ordination were, well, actually, that's not true. When the ELCA was first formed, a bishop or a bishop's representative or another pastor could preside at an ordination.
Okay.
When the ELCA had some conversations with the Episcopal Church, as well as others, about forming a closer partnership, one of the things that the Episcopal Church felt very strongly about was saying that only bishops could preside at ordinations. Didn't have to be their bishops. It could be their bishops or our bishops.
Just a
But
bishop.
it had to be a bishop, not another pastor. And so there was a fight over that. Some people felt like the Episcopal Church was, taking it a step too far, and saying, well, we want to be partners with you, but only if you become like us.
Okay.
Other people said this is a pretty minor concession, so we're okay with it.
Not a big deal. Yeah.
The churches who felt like this was a really significant problem broke off and formed a different denomination.
Okay.
And so that denomination was called Lutheran Churches in Mission for Christ, LCMC.
Okay.
Now, so that was a fairly small but different group that broke off. And they organize themselves a little differently than the ELCA. They organize themselves congregationally, which means instead of having a hierarchy where there's a bishop and somebody else, and then the pastor, and then the congregation, the congregation makes all the independent decisions for that group. So they organize congregationally, so it's the decisions, the final decision making is at the congregational level, whereas our final decision making is at the church-wide assembly level.
Okay, interesting.
In 2009, the ELCA voted on a human sexuality statement, and the vote allowed for ELCA congregations to ordain and to have as pastors persons who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, and were in committed lifelong relationships. Okay. It also allowed for pastors to, if they chose, to hold weddings for lesbian, gay, or bisexual couples who wanted a long-term monogamous relationship.
Okay. Oh, I think we're going to have more questions for Calvary coming up on that one. That's very interesting.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff about that. Well, as one would imagine, within any church denomination that has those conversations, some people agreed with the decisions of the ELCA and some people did not.
Okay, of course. Not everybody can agree.
Right, so some of the churches that did not agree with those denominations broke off and joined again the LCMC that we just talked about.
Okay.
Another group of those churches broke off and said, well, we disagree on this, but we don't like the congregational polity, the congregational organization of LCMC.
Okay.
So they formed a new group called North American Lutheran Churches.
Oh boy, I hope there's not going to be a quiz later.
Yeah, it's alphabet soup.
Yeah.
So they're called the NALC, North American Lutheran Churches, and they organize themselves a bit more structurally, hierarchically than Lutheran Churches and Mission for Christ.
Okay.
But both of those groups are offshoots from the ELCA in very recent times over particular decisions the ELCA made.
All right.
The vast majority of ELCA churches stayed, but there was a certain percentage that broke off over each of those decisions. So you've got the ELCA, the largest Lutheran denomination in the country. Then you've got these two recent break-off groups, Lutheran Churches and Mission for Christ and North American Lutheran Churches. And then you've got the historical groups that never joined in with the ELCA in the first place. And that would include the Missouri Synod Lutheran Churches, the Wisconsin Synod Lutheran Churches, and a bunch of other really, really small Lutheran church denominations.
Okay.
So that's kind of the big structure. And again, these are independent denominations. They don't do a lot of work together.
Okay.
And they're completely independently governed and organized.
Huh. Very interesting. All right. Well, thank you for shedding light on that. I appreciate it. And make sure to tune in next week for our next question for Pastor Jen. Thanks, everybody.
Sounds great. Thanks.
All right. Bye.